Secure the front line. Roger that. Moving to position. Watch the pressure on the turret.
According to the recon, the target is here. We deploy the half-tracks at this position.
They won't detect the broadcast until it's too late.
All teams, synchronize watch.
Wahrscheinlich ist das Beste, ich bin klokken uit de komst, dus je wagen vriendelijk jou. Verbied als snel computer advice, neem ons hier.
Position 2, report status. Ready for deployment on your mark.
In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the French countryside east of the Normandy beachhead, a German reconnaissance pilot flew his aircraft low over what appeared to be a major American armored concentration. Below him, he could see tanks, dozens of them, spread across the fields in the kind of dispersed formation that a well-trained army uses to minimize its vulnerability to air attack. He could see artillery pieces, supply vehicles, command tents. He could see the tracks that heavy equipment leaves in soft ground. He turned his aircraft back toward his base and filed his report. Significant American armored force, grid reference such and such, estimated strength at least 1 division, possibly more. His report was forwarded up the chain of command. German generals moved units in response. The American force he had observed and the threat implied shaped decisions that affected the disposition of German forces along a significant stretch of the front. The tanks he had seen were rubber, every single one of them. Inflatable rubber dummies, pumped up with hand pumps by American soldiers who were, for the most part, not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, radio operators, and actors assembled into a unit called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and tasked with one of the most unusual assignments in the history of the United States Army: to impersonate entire divisions of American fighting power that did not exist, using inflatable equipment, recorded, sound, fake radio traffic, and sheer theatrical audacity. The Ghost Army, that is what they called themselves informally, though the unit's official designation was deliberately bureaucratic and uninformative. 2,300 men, drawn from art schools and design studios and theater programs across America, given a crash course in military deception, and sent to Europe to perform the greatest battlefield theater in history. They performed it in France. They performed it in Luxembourg. They performed it in Germany. And they performed it so well and so consistently that the German commanders they were deceiving never fully understood what had happened to them even after the war was over. I want to tell you this story the way it deserves to be told. Not as a curiosity, not as a colorful footnote to the larger narrative of the Second World War in Europe, but as what it actually was: a serious military operation conceived by serious military minds, executed by extraordinarily talented people under conditions of genuine danger, that contributed materially to the Allied victory in Western Europe. The Ghost Army saved lives. It saved them not by fighting, but by making an enemy fight the wrong battle, in the wrong place, against an opponent that did not exist. The origins of the Ghost Army lie in the broader Allied approach to strategic deception that we have discussed in other episodes of the series. The double-cross system and Operation Fortitude had demonstrated, on the strategic level, what a well-executed deception program could achieve against an adversary who trusted his intelligence. The Ghost Army was a tactical application of the same principle, bringing deception down from the level of theater-wide strategic planning to the level of individual battles and local tactical situations. Where Fortitude had used double agents and false radio traffic to convince the Germans that an entire fictional army group existed, the Ghost Army used physical props and live performance to convince German commanders that specific American units were in specific locations when they were actually somewhere else entirely. The unit was activated in January 1944 and spent the months before D-Day training in the United States, and then in England. Its composition was unlike anything else in the American military. The The signal company that would generate the false radio traffic included some of the best radio operators in the Army, men with the skill to imitate the specific transmission styles of different divisions, to reproduce the characteristic patterns of unit radio nets, to make a fake headquarters sound indistinguishable from a real one to any German signals intelligence operator monitoring the frequencies. The Sonic Deception Company had a library of recorded battlefield sounds, tank engines, artillery fire, truck convoys, the ambient noise of large military formation, which they would play through powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks, projecting the acoustic signature of an armored division across the French countryside in the darkness. The visual deception component had the inflatable tanks and vehicles, the dummy artillery pieces, the camouflage netting and the track-laying equipment that could reproduce the ground signatures of heavy equipment movement. And then there were the artists. The Ghost Army had a disproportionate number of men who had come from creative backgrounds. The Fashion Institute of Technology, the Pratt Institute, the Art Students League of New York, the Philadelphia Museum School of Art. Men who in civilian life designed textiles and painted canvases and sketching cafes were now designing inflatable tank formations and sketching the French countryside and helping to paint divisional insignia on vehicles and equipment to make fake units look real. Among them were men who would go on to distinguished careers in American art and design. Ellsworth Kelly, who became one of the major figures of American abstract painting. Bill Blass, who became one of the great American fashion designers. Arthur Singer, whose wildlife illustrations became some of the most reproduced images in American natural history publishing. They were in France in 1944, pumping up rubber tanks and sewing shoulder patches and performing the most unusual artistic commission in the history of American military service. This is the moment I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. The Ghost Army is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, the layer beneath the visible history, the people and the operations that shaped the outcome of the war, without ever becoming household names. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and share this with someone who should be watching. And now back to France in the summer of 1944, because the Ghost Army's first operations were about to begin, and what they pulled off in those first weeks set the template for everything that followed. To understand what the Ghost Army was actually doing on the ground in France in 1944, you need to understand the tactical problem it was solving, a problem that arose directly from the nature of the Allied offensive operations in Western Europe after the Normandy breakout. The Allied advance through France in the late summer and fall of 1944 was rapid by the standards of the First World War, but it created its own logistical and tactical problems. As American divisions drove east toward Germany, they stretched their supply lines and extended their flanks. A flank is a vulnerability. It is a side of a military formation that is not facing the enemy's main force and is therefore potentially exposed to attack from an unexpected direction. Protecting flanks requires troops, and troops available for flank protection are troops not available for the main offensive effort. This is a fundamental tension in offensive warfare that every attacking force has to manage. The Ghost Army solution to this tension was elegant in principle and demanding in execution. Instead of assigning real troops to protect a flank, you assigned the Ghost Army to make the Germans believe that a real division was protecting it. The real troops who would otherwise have been tied down in flank security could then be added to the main offensive. The Germans, believing the flank to be held by a full division, would not attack it. The Ghost Army would hold the line, or rather, would perform holding the line long enough for the real offensive to achieve its objectives. Then the Ghost Army would quietly fold up its inflatable tanks, pack its loudspeakers into the half-tracks, and move to the next assignment. The timing and coordination this required was extraordinary. The Ghost Army had to appear in a new location, establish a convincing presence, and be ready to sustain the deception within hours, all while operating in a war zone where German artillery and aircraft were active threats. The unit had developed a drill for this that would have impressed a professional theatrical company. Teams knew exactly how long it took to inflate and position each type of dummy vehicle. The sonic operators knew the sequence for establishing a convincing acoustic signature for an armored unit settling into a new position. The radio operators knew the procedures for standing up a new fake divisional net and populating it with the kind of traffic that German signals intelligence would expect to hear. The physical equipment the Ghost Army used was the product of considerable research and development effort. The inflatable tanks were not crude blimps. They were carefully engineered to reproduce the silhouette of real armored vehicles. The Sherman tank, the M10 tank destroyer, the M7 self-propelled artillery. From the angles at which they were most likely to be observed, aerial reconnaissance, which saw them from above, and ground observation from distances of several miles. The designers had studied photographs of real vehicles from real reconnaissance missions and had adjusted the proportions of the inflatables to reproduce the visual cues that reconnaissance interpreters relied on. The tanks had to look right not from 10 feet away, but from 10,000 feet up and from 3 miles away across a French field. The sonic deception technology was, for 1944, genuinely sophisticated. The recordings that the Ghost Army used had been made at Fort Knox, using real tanks and real artillery pieces, and then edited and assembled into sequences that could be played back to simulate the acoustic signature of specific types of military activity. A tank column moving up, a division settling into defensive positions, an artillery battery registering fire. The speakers that played these recordings were powerful enough to project the sound across distances of 15 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. A German soldier in a forward position, hearing tank engine sounds from a direction where no tanks were supposed to be, would report what he heard, and that report would shape his commander's understanding of what was happening on the other side of the line. The radio deception was perhaps the most technically demanding of the three elements. German signals intelligence, like its American counterpart, monitored enemy radio traffic continuously, not just for content but for pattern. Every radio operator has a distinctive style, a characteristic rhythm in their Morse code transmission, particular habits in how they format messages and handle errors, a recognizable fingerprint that experienced signals intelligence analysts could identify and track. When a division moved from one sector to another, its radio operators moved with it, and a skilled German signals analyst could follow the movement by tracking the operator's fingerprints on the air. The Ghost Army's radio operators had to learn to imitate these fingerprints. When they impersonated a particular division, they had to reproduce not just that division's radio procedures and message formats, but the individual transmission styles of its operators. This required advanced work, studying recordings of the target division's radio traffic, practicing the imitation, getting it close enough to pass the scrutiny of German signals intelligence analysts who might be specifically looking for inconsistencies. It was a performance within a performance. Operators playing operators, their own identities subsumed into the characters they were inhabiting for the duration of the deception. The Ghost Army also used what its practitioners called atmosphere, a category of deception that was harder to find, but equally important to the overall effect. Atmosphere meant everything that a real military unit does that announces its presence without being a specific item of equipment or a specific radio transmission. It meant soldiers with the right divisional shoulder patches driving through nearby French towns in vehicles with the right unit markings. It meant officers visiting local mayors and farmers and dropping casual references to their unit and their situation. It meant the general ambient presence of a military formation, the way soldiers behave in villages, the way they interact with civilians, the stories they tell in cafes and bars, all carefully scripted to reinforce the impression that the unit the Germans believed was in the area was actually there. This aspect of the Ghost Army's work was particularly dangerous. It required Ghost Army soldiers to move through areas where they might encounter German agents or French collaborators who were reporting to German intelligence. A soldier carelessly out of character, forgetting which division he was supposed to be in, giving a detail that contradicted the cover story, could compromise the entire operation. The Ghost Army soldiers were briefed extensively on their cover identities and the cover stories of their units, and they maintained those identities in public with the discipline of actors who understood that breaking character had consequences that went beyond professional embarrassment. The Germans came close to penetrating the deception on several occasions. There were moments when German intelligence assessments expressed uncertainty about the units they believed to be in particular sectors, when the accumulated evidence was internally inconsistent in ways that a rigorous analyst might pursue. The Ghost Army's case officers monitored German intelligence assessments through signals intelligence when possible, and when they saw signs of German suspicion, they would adjust the deception, adding or removing elements, changing the character of the radio traffic, repositioning the visual elements to restore the plausibility of the performance. The men who executed these adjustments were doing something that had no established doctrine, no textbook, no training manual that told them exactly what to do. They were improvising in real time, in a war zone, making professional judgments about the perceptions of an adversary they could not see and could only partially monitor. The fact that they got it right consistently, over 11 months of operations, is a testament to the quality of the people the Army had assembled. Not to any particular genius in the institutional design of the unit, but to the accumulated insight of 2,300 individuals who understood, from their own creative backgrounds, how perception works and how it can be shaped. The Ghost Army also benefited, as the double-cross system had benefited, from a structural advantage on the other side. The German military intelligence system in Western Europe in 1944 was operating under conditions of severe stress. It had been repeatedly surprised by the scale of the Allied landings, by the speed of the breakout, by the depth and rapidity of the advance across France. Its communications had been penetrated by Allied signals intelligence. Its human sources in Allied-controlled territory were limited. The picture was building of the Allied order of battle was already significantly degraded by these problems, and was therefore more susceptible than it might otherwise have been to the Ghost Army's additions to that picture. A German intelligence system operating under ideal conditions might have identified the Ghost Army's deceptions more quickly. The system that actually existed in France in 1944 did not. The individual soldiers of the Ghost Army left behind a record of the war that is unlike almost any other, not an official document alone, but in sketchbooks and paintings and letters home that capture the particular experience of men who were trained to look at the world and have been placed in one of history's most visually extraordinary situations. The French countryside through which the Ghost Army moved in the summer and fall of 1944 was simultaneously beautiful and devastated. The Normandy bocage, the ancient hedgerow landscape of small fields and sunken lanes, was scarred by the fighting of the breakout, but still essentially itself, a landscape of extraordinary visual richness. Beyond Normandy, as the advance accelerated across France, the Ghost Army moved through villages and towns and cities that ranged from largely untouched to badly damaged, through a country in the process of liberation that expressed itself differently in different places, with joy, with caution, with the complicated emotions of people who had been occupied for 4 years and were only beginning to understand that the occupation was ending. The artists among the Ghost Army soldiers recorded all of this. Their sketchbooks in the campaign are remarkable documents, filled with drawings of French villages and damaged churches and the faces of civilians, alongside more intimate observations of military life. The rubber tanks deflated and stacked in truck beds, the loudspeaker half-tracks parked under trees, the operations rooms and farmhouses where maps were spread on kitchen tables and officers argued about the next deployment. These sketches are, among other things, some of the most honest records of what the Second World War in Europe actually looked like at the ground level, the mundane details that official photography rarely captured and that the participants' own memories, filtered through decades, tended to reshape and simplify. The artists were also, by temperament and training, acutely conscious of the strangeness of their situation. They were performing war rather than fighting it, and they knew it, not in a way that made them feel less committed or less courageous, but in a way that gave them a particular kind of perspective on what they were doing. A frontline soldier experiences combat as immediate, visceral, overwhelming. The senses engaged to their limits, the mind focused entirely on survival and mission. A Ghost Army soldier, inflating a rubber tank in a French field at night with German artillery audible in the middle distance, experienced something different. The combination of physical danger with the awareness of playing a role, the theatrical self-consciousness that persists even under fire. Several of the Ghost Army's artists described this quality of experience in later interviews. The sense of simultaneous danger and unreality, of doing something that was objectively absurd and objectively serious at the same time. Bill Blass described his Ghost Army service as a formative experience of his life, not because of anything heroic that happened to him. He was quick to note that he had never been in direct combat, that the Ghost Army's mission was specifically designed to avoid that, but because of the quality of attention it required. The attention that a fashion designer brings to the way a garment reads across a room, the way it moves, the way it establishes an impression in the viewer's mind before any specific detail is registered. This was exactly the attention the Ghost Army demanded. He had been trained in it by the Army, without quite realizing that training was what was happening. Ellsworth Kelly was more direct about the connection between the Ghost Army and his later work. His experience with camouflage and visual deception, the study of how forms were perceived at different scales and angles, how colors and patterns could create or disrupt the impression of three-dimensional shapes, fed directly into the formal concerns of his mature painting. The hard-edged abstraction for which he became famous is, among other things, the work of a man who spent a significant portion of 1944 and 1945 thinking systematically about how shapes are perceived and how perception can be manipulated. The Ghost Army had given him a laboratory, and what he learned in it shaped everything he made afterward. The story of the Ghost Army also illuminates something about American military culture in the Second World War that is easy to miss in the larger narrative of industrial production and massive troop deployments. The American military in that war was, in certain ways, more flexible and more willing to experiment than its size and institutional weight might suggest. The Ghost Army was not the product of a conventional military planning process. It was a product of a relatively small number of people who understood that deception could be militarily effective and who were given the institutional space, unusual in any army, to develop and test that understanding. The unit's commanding officer for much of its operational history was a colonel named Harry Reeder, whose approach to leadership was as unconventional as the unit he commanded. Reeder understood that the Ghost Army's effectiveness depended on the individual judgment and initiative of its soldiers in ways that conventional military units did not. A private in an infantry division executing a standard tactical maneuver has a defined role in a defined procedure. A Ghost Army private positioning an inflatable tank in a French field at night was exercising professional judgment about where it needed to be, at what angle, with what camouflage, to produce the right impression from the most likely angle of German observation. The private needed to understand the objective well enough to make good decisions about the means, and that required a different kind of leadership than conventional military typically provided. Reeder gave his men that kind of leadership. He explained objectives clearly and then trusted the soldiers to figure out how to achieve them. He valued the ideas that came from the artists and the designers and the radio operators who had specialized knowledge about their own domains. He ran the Ghost Army less like a military unit and more like the creative enterprise it actually was, a collaborative effort in which the relevant expertise was distributed across the organization rather than concentrated at the top of the hierarchy. This management style produced results. It also produced, in the soldiers who experienced it, a particular kind of commitment and pride in their work that conventional military units did not always generate. The Ghost Army soldiers knew they were doing something unusual. They knew it required skills that the conventional army did not value, but that they possessed. And they knew that when they got it right, when the rubber tanks were in the right place and the loudspeakers were playing the right sounds and the radio operators were transmitting the right traffic and the German commander in his operations room was making decisions based on a false picture they had constructed, they had done something that mattered, that had real military value, that had potentially saved the lives of the real soldiers they were covering. That knowledge and the pride that came with it sustained the Ghost Army through its 11 months of operations. It sustained the veterans through the decades of silence that followed, through the years when they could not tell their families what they had done, and when the official history of the war gave no hint that their contribution had existed. And it is present unmistakably in the interviews that were conducted with the surviving veterans after the declassification, the quiet satisfaction of old men looking back at something they'd done well under difficult circumstances, for important purposes, and done well enough to matter. The Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2022. The citation described the unit's contribution to the Allied victory in Western Europe in the careful language of official recognition. It noted the operations the units impersonated, the scale of the deception, what it could not fully capture, what no official document can fully capture, was a particular quality of what the Ghost Army had achieved: the application of artistic intelligence to military problems, the discovery that the skills of painters and designers and sound engineers and actors were, in the right circumstances, military assets of the first order. The war tested many kinds of human capability. It tested physical courage and endurance. It tested industrial capacity and logistical skill. It tested the ability of democratic societies to mobilize their populations and sustain the effort of total war over years. What the Ghost Army tested and what it demonstrated could produce decisive results was something more unusual: the ability to understand perception, to shape the picture that an adversary's mind constructs from available evidence, to perform convincingly under conditions where the consequences of a failed performance were measured in lives. That is a rare capability. The Ghost Army had it, and in the 11 months between the Normandy breakout and the crossing of the Rhine, it used that capability to win, quietly, invisibly, with rubber tanks and loudspeakers in the dark. After the war, when the Ghost Army's record were eventually made public, military historians found in them something unexpected. Detailed after-action reports had described, with considerable precision, what the Ghost Army had done in each operation and what it believed the effects had been. The unit had kept meticulous records, partly because its officers understood they were doing something historically significant, and partly because the kind of people who ran the Ghost Army were the kind of people who wrote things down. The records made clear that the unit had been consistently effective, that its deceptions had consistently shaped German behavior in the intended directions, and that the cumulative effect of its operations had been to give the real American forces it was supporting a series of tactical advantages that contributed measurably to the speed and efficiency of the Allied advance. Those records sat classified for 50 years. The veterans went home and built their lives. The artists painted. The designers designed. The radio operators found other applications for their skills. And in 1996, when a researcher named Rick Bayer stumbled across the declassified files and began to understand what he was reading, the Ghost Army finally got its history. Bayer's documentary film, and subsequently his book, brought the story to public attention for the first time and prompted the surviving veterans, most of them in their 80s and 90s by then, to speak publicly about what they had done for the first time in their lives. Their accounts, preserved in interviews conducted in the last years of many of their lives, are among the most remarkable oral histories of the Second World War, not for their drama, though the drama was real, but for a particular quality of reflection that comes from a man in his 80s looking back at himself at 22. They had been boys, most of them, boys from art schools and design programs, given rubber tanks and loudspeakers and told to go fool Hitler's generals. And they had done it. They had done it over and over again for 11 months across France and Luxembourg and Germany. And the generals had been fooled, and the real soldiers whose flanks they protected had been able to fight the battles they needed to fight without worrying about what was happening on their exposed sides. The question of how to measure the Ghost Army's contribution to the Allied victory in Western Europe is one that military historians have approached with the caution appropriate to any claim about counterfactual outcomes. What we know is what happened. What we cannot know with certainty is what would have happened if the Ghost Army had not been there, if the flanks it covered had been left unprotected, if the German commanders it deceived had responded to the actual rather than the apparent disposition of American forces. What the records allow us to say, with reasonable confidence, is that the German commanders in the sectors where the Ghost Army operated consistently made decisions that reflected their acceptance of the Ghost Army's false picture. They held back forces that might otherwise have been committed. They reinforced sectors where threats were apparent, threats that were fictional, rather than sectors where the real American offensive was developing. They hesitated at moments when hesitation was costly for them and valuable for the Americans on the other side of the line. The cumulative effect of this German hesitation and misallocation of resources across more than 20 operations over 11 months was a measurable contribution to the speed and efficiency of the Allied advance. The specific operations where the Ghost Army's contribution can be traced most clearly in the documentary record are instructive. At Brest in August 1944, the Ghost Army covered the left flank of the American forces besieging the German garrison, while the real units that would otherwise have held that flank were free to participate in the pursuit of German forces retreating across France. The deception held long enough, the Germans in and around Brest believing the flank was more strongly held than it was, to allow the main American effort to proceed without the flank attack that might otherwise have developed. At the Moselle River crossings in September 1944, the Ghost Army supported the operations of 2 American divisions attempting to cross in the face of German resistance by simulating a third crossing operation at a point where no crossing was planned, drawing German attention and reserves away from the real crossing sites. The after-action report filed by the Ghost Army after this operation noted that the deception had been accepted by German intelligence, that German forces had repositioned in response to the false crossing, and that this repositioning had eased the task of the real crossing forces in ways that were observable in the subsequent fighting. At Saarlautern in November 1944, the Ghost Army conducted one of its most complex operations, impersonating 2 full divisions simultaneously, while covering the movement of real units to a new attack axis. The operation required maintaining false radio nets for both fictional divisions, deploying visual elements across a front of sufficient width to be credible, and sustaining the sonic deception through multiple nights in cold, wet conditions that tested the endurance of the Ghost Army soldiers as severely as any more conventional military operation. The Rhine crossing operation in March 1945, the Ghost Army's final major deployment, was also its most significant in terms of the scale of the forces being supported and the consequences of its success or failure. The Rhine was the last major natural barrier between the Allied forces and the German heartland. Crossing it required the concentration of enormous Allied forces at specific points, and the success of the crossings depended in part on keeping the Germans uncertain about where the main effort would be made until a moment when it was too late for them to respond effectively. The Ghost Army's role in this operation was to simulate a major crossing preparation at a point well north of the actual crossing sites, drawing German attention, and reserves northward while the real crossings were executed further south. The sonic deception operated at maximum scale, loudspeaker projecting the sound of a massive armored force moving to the riverbank, of bridging equipment being deployed, of the ambient activity of a corps preparing to cross. The radio deception was correspondingly elaborate, with false nets simulating the communications of multiple divisions and a corps headquarters coordinating the fictional operation. The Rhine crossing succeeded. The American forces had crossed established bridgeheads that were not immediately counterattacked in the overwhelming strength that might have been expected. The German forces in the area of the Ghost Army's false operation were slower to respond to the real crossings than they would have been if their attention had not been divided, and their reserves positioned partly to counter a threat that did not exist. The end of the war in Europe came quickly after the Rhine crossing. By May 1945, the fighting was over. The Ghost Army was demobilized, and the 2,300 men, who had made up the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, went home to resume the civilian lives the war had interrupted. The classification that descended over the unit's records ensured that their contribution would remain invisible to the public for decades, that the history books written in the immediate aftermath of the war would tell the story of the Allied victory in Western Europe without mentioning the army that had never existed. The invisibility was, in a sense, the appropriate condition for an organization whose entire purpose was to be something it was not. The Ghost Army had spent 11 months being invisible in the most literal sense, being the simulacrum of a military force rather than the force itself, existing in the German commander's picture of the battlefield rather than in any physical reality. For its own contribution to the historical record to be equally invisible, equally present only in the effects rather than the causes, had a certain poetic consistency. But it also meant that the men who had done the work went unrewarded in a way that their contribution did not deserve. The soldiers of ordinary infantry and armored divisions came home to a country that knew what they had done, at least in general terms, that knew they had fought across France and Germany, and that the fighting had been hard and the casualties real. The Ghost Army soldiers came home carrying a secret that they could not share, their specific contribution unacknowledged, the unusual and genuinely creative thing they had accomplished invisible to the people around them. Some of them found this acceptable. They had done what needed doing, and the fact that it had worked was its own reward, in a way that any professional finds satisfaction in work well executed regardless of whether it is publicly recognized. Others found it frustrating, found it difficult to watch the conventional narrative of the war being assembled without their part in it, to hear the campaigns they had participated in described without any reference to the element that had made those campaigns possible in certain critical moments. All of them, as far as the record shows, maintained the classification. No one broke the secret before the official declassification in 1996. The artists and designers went back to their studios and their drawing boards and their design firms, carrying the knowledge of what they had done, and they did not talk about it. This discipline, the same discipline that had made the Ghost Army operationally effective, sustained the security of the secret for 50 years. When the story finally came out, the reaction was everything the veterans might have hoped for. Amazement, admiration, the recognition that they had done something genuinely remarkable. The documentaries and the books, and eventually the Congressional Gold Medal brought the Ghost Army into the public record in a way that gave the veterans and their families something they had long been denied. The recognition came late for many of them, but it came. The Ghost Army story matters not just as a historical curiosity, but as a demonstration of something important about the relationship between creative intelligence and military effectiveness. The conventional military mind tends to think about capability in terms of firepower and manpower, the number of tanks, the number of soldiers, the weight of artillery that can be brought to bear. The Ghost Army demonstrated that perception is also a capability, that the ability to shape what an adversary believes can substitute for the physical force that would otherwise be required to achieve the same result. 2,000 men with rubber tanks and loudspeakers accomplished what might have taken tens of thousands of real soldiers to accomplish through conventional means. The protection of flanks, the fixing of German forces in place, the creation of operational space for the real offensive to develop. They did it not by overpowering the German defenders, but by redirecting their attention, by making them respond to a threat that did not exist, by using the space between the German commander's perception and the actual reality of the battlefield to enable the American advance. That is an important lesson. It was an important lesson in 1944. It remains an important lesson now. The war is always partly fought in the space between what the enemy knows and what is actually happening. In the gap between intelligence and reality, between perception and truth. The Ghost Army understood this with unusual clarity and exploited it with unusual skill. They were artists operating in a domain that had not previously been considered artistic. They brought to it the artist's understanding of how images work, how sounds work, how the mind constructs a picture from available cues and fills in the gaps with expectation. And they used that understanding to change the outcome of battles, to protect the lives of soldiers who never knew they were being protected, and to contribute to the Allied victory in Western Europe in ways that are only now being fully understood. That is enough. For 2,300 men with rubber tanks and loudspeakers and false radio voices in the dark, it is more than enough. The Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow, was awarded to the Ghost Army veterans in 2022, 77 years after the end of the war they had served in, and more than 20 years after the declassification that finally allowed their story to be told. By the time of the award, very few of them were still alive to receive it. The ceremony was attended by a handful of very old men, and by the families of the many who had not survived to see the recognition they had earned. It was, by any measure, recognition that had arrived too late. But it was also recognition that had arrived, which puts the Ghost Army ahead of many operations whose contributions to the Allied victory remain either classified or simply unacknowledged. The story is now told. The names are on the record. The rubber tanks and the loudspeakers and the false radio nets and the shoulder patches worn by artists playing soldiers. All of it is part of the history of the Second World War, a history that is larger and stranger and more creative than conventional version has ever fully captured. That is the Ghost Army. 2,300 men, rubber tanks and loudspeakers and false radio voices in the dark. A contribution to victory that was real and significant and invisible. An army that existed only in the minds of the men it was fooling. And that was enough to change the course of the war. The Ghost Army's first significant operational deployment came in late July 1944, as the Allied forces were attempting to break out of the Normandy beachhead. The breakout, Operation Cobra, required the concentration of American armored forces for a powerful thrust through the German lines. But concentrating forces creates gaps, and gaps invite counterattack. The Ghost Army's job was to fill those gaps with the appearance of force, to make the German commanders believe that the flanks of the American advance were protected by units that were actually somewhere else, buying time for the real forces to achieve their objectives before the deception was discovered. The operation required the Ghost Army to move into position, deploy its equipment, establish its false radio nets, activate its sonic deception, and be convincing, all within a timeline measured in hours rather than days, and in areas where German observation was possible and German artillery was a real and present danger. This was not a comfortable exercise conducted behind friendly lines. It was a combat deployment, carried out by men who were equipped for theater but operating in a war zone. The deceptions were layered. The sonic half-tracks would park in wooded areas near the front and play tank engine sounds through the night. The sound of an armored column moving up, parking, engines idling, the random noise of large units settling into a new position. The radio operators would establish the fake nets for the division being impersonated, transmitting the kind of traffic that a division headquarters generates. Supply requests, personnel reports, coordination messages with adjacent units. The visual elements would be positioned where German area reconnaissance was likely to observe them. The inflatable tanks in fields, the dummy artillery pieces on ridge lines, the vehicles on roads and kind of dispersed formation that any competent German analyst would recognize as real. The men who did this work lived with a particular kind of stress that was different from the stress of conventional combat. A frontline soldier faces danger that is immediate and visible. The Ghost Army soldiers faced danger that was ambient and unpredictable. The possibility that German artillery would range in on their position, not because of anything they'd done wrong, but simply because they were in the wrong place when a shell fell. They also lived with the knowledge that their mission depended on not being discovered, and that discovery was a possibility that no amount of skill could entirely eliminate. If the Germans figured out that the division holding a particular sector was a phantom, 2,000 men with rubber tanks instead of 15,000 men with real ones, the consequences could be catastrophic. They were never fully discovered. Over the course of more than 20 operations between the Normandy breakout and the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, the Ghost Army impersonated at least 35 different American divisions and supported the operations of hundreds of thousands of real soldiers whose flanks they protected and whose movements they masked. The operations range from relatively straightforward demonstrations in quiet sectors to genuinely complex multi-layered deceptions that require coordinating all three elements, visual, sonic, and radio, simultaneously across a front of many miles. One of the most impressive of these was the operation at the Siegfried Line in September 1944, when the Ghost Army impersonated two full divisions, while the real units they were covering repositioned for a new axis of attack. The deception required maintaining false radio nets for both divisions simultaneously, deploying visual elements across a front wide enough to be credible for two divisional sectors, and sustaining the sonic deception through multiple nights. It was, in the terms of theatrical production, an extraordinarily ambitious performance, a show running simultaneously on multiple stages, with a cast of 2,000 playing roles written for 30,000, in front of an audience that would kill them if it figured out what was happening. The German reaction to the Ghost Army's operations provides some of the best evidence of how effective the deception was. German intelligence assessments of the American order of battle in Western Europe consistently overestimated the number of divisions available to Allied commanders, in part because the Ghost Army's impersonations had convinced German analysts that units were present in sectors where they were not actually deployed. This overestimation had real operational consequences. German commanders were more cautious about attacking what appeared to be well-defended sectors, more willing to hold back reserves against threats that did not materialize, more uncertain about where the actual weight of American offensive power was concentrated. The Ghost Army's final and most significant operation was in late March 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe. The Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine at Remagen and at several other points, and the crossings required keeping the Germans uncertain about where the main effort would be made. The Ghost Army was deployed to simulate a major crossing operation at a point where no crossing was actually planned, drawing German attention and reserves away from the real crossing sites. The operation involved all three deception elements operating at maximum intensity, massive sonic deception suggesting a huge armor formation moving to the riverbank, extensive radio traffic suggesting a corps headquarters coordinating the false crossing, and visual elements positioned to be observed by German forces on the far bank. The Rhine crossing succeeded. The German forces in the area of the Ghost Army's false operation were slower to respond to the real crossings than they might have been without the distraction. The margin between success and catastrophe at the Rhine was not created solely by the Ghost Army's deception, but the deception contributed to it in ways that the operational commanders who worked with the unit consistently acknowledged. What made the Ghost Army work, at a fundamental level, was something that goes beyond the specific techniques of inflatable tanks and recorded sound. It was an understanding of how the human mind, including the mind of a trained military intelligence officer, processes incomplete information. A German reconnaissance pilot flying over the French countryside did not see rubber tanks. He saw the approximate shape and size and distribution of armored vehicles. He saw what he expected to see, because the Ghost Army's designers had studied what real armor formations look like from the air and had reproduced those characteristics with sufficient fidelity to trigger the expected interpretation. The pilot's mind did the rest, filling in the gaps, completing the picture, confirming the existence of a threat that the pilot's training and experience told him was consistent with what he was observing. This is a principle that runs through all successful deception, from the double-cross system's management of German beliefs about Normandy to the Ghost Army's management of German beliefs about American unit dispositions at the tactical level. Deception does not require creating something that looks exactly like the real thing. It requires creating something that triggers the right interpretation in a mind already predisposed toward that interpretation. The Germans expected American armored forces to be in certain places because the overall logic of the military situation suggested they would be there. The Ghost Army gave them just enough evidence to confirm those expectations. The men of the Ghost Army were demobilized at the end of the war and sent home to civilian life without being able to talk about what they had done. The operation was classified for decades until 1996, when the records were finally declassified and the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops could be told publicly for the first time. Many of the men who had served in it were elderly by then. Some had died without ever being able to share the most extraordinary chapter of their lives. The artists among them had built distinguished careers in the decades between the war and the declassification. Careers built on the same visual intelligence, the same understanding of perception and representation that had made them valuable to the Ghost Army in the first place. Ellsworth Kelly, looking back on his time with the Ghost Army late in his life, described the experience as formative in ways that went beyond the military service itself. The discipline of observation required for deception work, the need to understand not just what things look like, but how they were perceived, what cues the viewer's mind latched onto, and what cues it ignored, was a discipline that fed directly into his later work as a painter. The Ghost Army had trained him, in a sense, in the grammar of visual perception, and that grammar showed up in his canvases for the rest of his life. Bill Blass was more circumspect about the connection between his Ghost Army service and his later career in fashion design, but the people who knew him well noted that his approach to design, his understanding of silhouette and proportion, and the way a garment reads from a distance, had a precision that went beyond conventional training. The Ghost Army had given him a practical education in how things look at the scale at which they are meant to be seen, which is exactly the knowledge a fashion designer needs. These individual stories matter because they illuminate something about the Ghost Army that the operational history alone cannot capture. The unit worked because it had assembled people with a specific kind of intelligence, visual, perceptual, theatrical, that the conventional military had no framework for valuing. But that turned out to be exactly what the most unusual military requirement of the war demanded. The Army had not set out to create a unit of artists and designers. It had set out to create a deception unit. And the requirement of deception had led, through a series of institutional decisions that were not always fully understood by the people making them, to the recruitment of exactly the people who were needed. There is a lesson in that about the relationship between creative intelligence and military effectiveness that has been absorbed slowly and imperfectly by military establishments in the decades since the Second World War. The Ghost Army demonstrated that the skills developed in art schools and design studios and theater programs, skills that had no obvious military application, could be among the most militarily valuable skills in the right circumstances. The circumstances have to be right. The institutional framework has to be willing to recognize and use those skills. And the people with those skills have to be willing to apply them to problems they did not train for. In the summer and fall of 1944, all of those conditions were met. The result was 2,300 men who performed the war's most extraordinary act of collective theater and won. The Ghost Army story was classified for more than 50 years. The men who served in it went home and built their lives and did not talk about what they had done, even to their families. The artists painted. The designers designed. The radio operators found other work for their skills. They were ordinary men living ordinary lives, carrying the memory of an extraordinary thing they had accomplished and could not describe. When the records were finally declassified in 1996, and the journalists and historians began to piece the story together from the documents and the surviving veterans, what emerged was not just a remarkable military operation, but a portrait of a generation. The generation that had come of age in the Depression, gone to war at 20 or 22, done things that redefined the limits of what was possible, and then come home and gotten on with it. The Ghost Army veterans, interviewed in their 70s and 80s, described the war years with a mixture of pride and wonder that had not diminished in the decade since. They had done something that mattered. They had done it with the skills they had, with paint and sound and rubber and radio, and it had worked. That is the Ghost Army. 2,000 men, 35 divisions impersonated, 20-plus operations over 11 months of combat, a contribution to the Allied victory in Western Europe that was real and significant and entirely invisible to the people who benefited from it most. An army that was not an army, winning battles that were not battles, in a war that was also a performance, and pulling it off completely. There is something specific about the Ghost Army's deployment at the Siegfried Line in September 1944 that illustrates the full complexity of what the unit was being asked to do. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall as the Germans called it, was a system of fortifications along Germany's western border that had been constructed in the late 1930s, and that represented, in the fall of 1944, the last major defensive barrier before the Rhine. American forces were probing its defenses along a broad front, looking for weaknesses, trying to identify the best points for a concentrated attack. The Ghost Army's job was to make the Germans uncertain about where that concentrated attack would fall, to keep German reserves distributed along the front rather than concentrated at the actual point of main effort. The Siegfried Line operation required the Ghost Army to be in multiple places effectively simultaneously, to create the impression of significant American force presence along a front too wide for 2,000 men to physically cover. The unit divided its elements, maintaining separate deception packages at multiple points, coordinating their radio traffic and sonic deception through a central operations element that was itself operating under conditions of genuine danger from German artillery. The soldiers who drove the loudspeaker half-tracks to within range of the German positions were not in a safe rear area. They were in range of the German guns. The decision to make the sonic deception audible to German forward positions required approaching those positions closely enough that the approach itself was a tactical risk. The Ghost Army's after-action report on the Siegfried Line operation described it as the unit's most technically demanding deployment to date. The coordination required, the scale of the front being covered, the simultaneity of the multiple deception packages, all of it had stretched the unit's capabilities to their limits. The report also noted that the deception appeared to have been largely successful. German reserves had remained distributed rather than concentrated. The actual American probing attacks had encountered less coordinated resistance than they might have in the absence of the deception, and the intelligence picture the Germans had formed of American intentions remained confused throughout the operation. Confused intelligence. That was the Ghost Army's gift to the commanders it served. Not certainty about the wrong thing, but uncertainty about everything. A German commander facing uncertain intelligence about American dispositions had to hedge. He had to keep reserves that might respond to multiple possible threats rather than committing them to counter a single known threat. He had to be cautious in ways that cost him initiative and flexibility at exactly the moments when initiative and flexibility were most valuable. The Ghost Army didn't need the Germans to believe a specific lie. It needed them to be uncertain. And uncertainty in military operations is almost as good as a lie, sometimes better. The Ghost Army's soldiers understood this intuitively, even when they couldn't articulate it in the theoretical terms a military strategist might use. They understood it the way artists understand composition, not as a formula, but as a felt sense of what worked and what didn't, of when the picture was right and when something was off. When an inflatable tank was positioned correctly, at the right angle and the right distance from where German observation was most likely, with the right track marks in the ground around it and the right ambient noise in the surrounding air, it was right in a way that the men could feel as well as calculate. When something was off, when the spacing was wrong or the camouflage was inconsistent or the track marks didn't match the vehicle type, they felt that too. They corrected it. They did it again. They got it right. That is what artists do. That is what the Ghost Army did. And in the doing of it, across 11 months of the most destructive war in history, They built something that deserves to be called a masterpiece, an invisible masterpiece, performed once and never repeated, for an audience that never knew it was watching.